Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk a little bit about the war that kind of wasn't a war really, but was more two countries angrily shaking their fists, trying to make the other one flinch, and occasionally kind of paying somebody else to fight for them, and then when asked if they paid this person to attack the other, they kind of just go, "What? Of course not, no, but yeah." Yes, it's the Cold War, basically 50 years of the United States and the Soviet Union threatening to destroy each other and the world, if the other one got a little too big for their britches and made a move. At least on paper, the Cold War was about communism, with the Soviets looking to spread communism and their influence, and with the US and NATO looking to prevent that. Now, you could certainly make the argument that the war was more about just spheres of influence, really, and that the Soviets weren't actually communist by the definition of it, but because they didn't align with Western values broadly, the conflict began. But really, that's a whole can of worms to be opened on a different day. Instead, let's talk about the war itself and what the US, NATO, and the Soviets did to conduct their warfare. Now, the US and USSR couldn't directly combat each other due to the fact that both possessed nuclear weaponry. You know, the whole mutually assured destruction thing, where even if you strike first, the other has the capability to retaliate, and due to the power of nukes, that retaliatory strike would be equally as destructive. So instead, direct conflict between the two entities was basically limited to spying, producing stronger weapons, and pointing those weapons at one another. The name of the game of the Cold War would instead be indirect conflict, economic and political warfare, proxy wars, etc. This could range anywhere from foreign trade deals that box out the other, funding political opposition in countries controlled by the enemy, performing covert regime changes in enemy-aligned countries, all the way up to engaging in direct proxy wars with countries that were supported by the other. All of these, and more, fought the enemy without directly engaging with them, which meant that the enemy had basically no technical reason to directly retaliate, thus avoiding a new world war and keeping the world intact. But because of the significant power and global influence the US and USSR had at this time, this meant that their spy and intelligence networks would have been significant and vast as well, and in an effort to remain superior to their enemy and gain new information that could help them in that effort, there had to be this shroud of secrecy, subterfuge, and trickery. It's in this secrecy and trickery that our subject for today lies, an American project from early in the Cold War that was overly disguised as an experimental X-plane. This is the Bell X-16. Its story begins in the early 1950s, around the time of the Korean War, and around the end of the Korean War in late 1952, early 1953, where the back and forth of the early war had evolved, or devolved rather, into an effective stalemate around the 38th parallel, while Western-aligned forces initially sought to overthrow the North Korean government and actively push back against and reverse Soviet influence and territorial gains, the war devolving into a stalemate effectively made it concrete that the strategy going forward would revolve around the containment of communism, rather than these concerted efforts to directly push back. For the containment strategy, and honestly for a more direct strategy too, it would be incredibly beneficial, if not necessary, to have something that could gather information on the Soviets, some kind of long-range stealth reconnaissance aircraft that could scour the entirety of the Soviet Union for new military installations, projects, suspicious structures, and basically everything else. To contain the Soviets, America needed clear and concrete information on what the Soviets were doing, and so what they needed was a spy plane. So in the early 1950s, with a spy plane becoming more and more enticing to pursue, the Air Force commissioned the Beacon Hill Report in mid-1952 to analyze America's reconnaissance and intelligence capabilities, and to emphasize the importance of improving America's recon and intelligence capabilities in an effort to protect America and also lay plans for a potential direct war that might lie in the future. On the first page of this report, they emphasized the importance of improved intelligence capabilities with regards to containment, saying our containment policy faces a Soviet strategy of local incidents and surprise aggressions. We are forced to meet this with an increasingly mobile fire department technique, with limited forces holding the line at widely separated danger zones across the world. Advanced knowledge is of the essence in this conflict of maneuver. And later on the exact same page, the question now becomes, which is smarter? Which can learn more about the vulnerability of the other and adapt its forces most shrewdly and precisely to exploit the other's weakness? But due to ever-improving military technology in the realm of radar and jet engines and high-altitude aircraft, you would need far more specialized reconnaissance aircraft that could fly high or fast or stealthily enough to avoid enemy defenses. No longer could you just slap some cameras on your run-of-the-mill fighter and send it out there and have it do a good job. You needed something specially designed for recon. Really driving this fact home was the fact that in the preceding years, in the late 40s and very early 50s, some aircraft converted to reconnaissance roles, like the Douglas DC-4, Boeing B-29, and Boeing B-50, had been shot down by Soviet fighter jets while performing recon, with those planes not having the speed or altitude capabilities to avoid being intercepted and shot down. So, for this new era of aerial reconnaissance under the broader code name of Bald Eagle, on March 27, 1953, the U.S. Air Force issued new specifications for a new high-altitude recon aircraft that needed impressive range. Specifically, they called for a plane with a cruising altitude upwards of 70,000 feet, an operational radius of 1,500 nautical miles, or an overall range upwards of 3,000 nautical miles, a payload of 700 pounds purely for camera equipment, and a powerhouse or powerhouses that used currently in production and in use jet engines. The 70,000-foot cruising altitude was sought, as the Soviets had and used British and American radar technology that they had received during World War II, and that radar reached upwards of 60 to 65,000 feet. American military leadership assumed that the Soviets were still using this technology, so an altitude of 70,000 feet would be sufficient to defeat it. As it turns out, the Soviets had actually developed past this, but America didn't actually know that. To these specifications, though, in July 1953, 3 companies would receive contracts for studying and research of this kind of aircraft, and they were Bell, Fairchild, and Martin. Bell was presumably selected due to their established work on various experimental X-planes. Fairchild was probably selected because they didn't have a lot going on at the moment, I guess. Honestly, they seem like kind of a weird selection here. And Martin was likely selected both due to post-war work on jet and patrol bombers, and the fact that they were working on the B-57, a twin-engine jet bomber that was actually just a licensed version of a British plane known as the English Electric Canberra, and this plane could be relatively easily converted to a high-altitude recon role. 6 months later, in early 1954, after their research contracts concluded, all three companies would present designs based around their research. Bell would present their Model 67, Fairchild their Model 195, and Martin their Model 294. Martin's design, based heavily off the B-57, had a bit of a leg up over the other two, with the B-57 itself providing some amount of data and evidence on how the Model 294 would perform. The 294 wasn't exactly the same plane, though, and because of its high-altitude recon role, the wingspan of the 294 would be significantly greater, sitting at 32.3 meters compared to 19.5 meters on the standard B-57, and several other design alterations would be made in tandem. Powered by a pair of Pratt & Whitney J57 engines, the engine of choice for the three designs that were presented, the 294 would have a range around 3,000 miles and a max cruising altitude of around 67,000 feet, slightly lower than what was called for, but due to the design being a derivative of a more established plane, the slightly lesser specs could probably be ignored for now. For Fairchild's proposal, information on their design seems to be more sparse than the other two, which kinda spoils what happened to the project, but, But from what I could find, the Model 195 was a wide-winged aircraft, with a wingspan of 27.43 meters, and it would be powered by a single J57 engine, installed on the top of the fuselage just behind the cockpit. The 195 would have a cruising altitude of around 65,000 feet and a range roughly around 3,000 miles. So overall it was slightly lesser than the Model 294, but perhaps the fact that it used just one jet engine instead of two could give it a small advantage, at least in cost. Lastly, for Bell's design, in an effort to make that high-flying, long-range recon plane the Air Force sought, Bell made what appeared to be a rather thin, dare say flimsy-looking wide-wing aircraft, measuring in at 18.55 meters long, 35 meters wide, and 5.2 meters tall, nearly twice as wide as it was long. Bell's Model 67 had a thin fuselage and relatively thin and swept-back wings. In an effort to keep the weight as low as possible, the Model 67 would also sport a monotrack landing gear setup, with the main wheels all sitting on the thin fuselage, and there would be a pair of small, light wheels out on the wings, about halfway to the tips, purely for balancing purposes while on the ground. With that landing gear setup and the rail-thin frame, the Model 67 did end up being remarkably light for its size. For comparison's sake, we'll use the Heinkel HE-177, which had similar dimensions and two engines, and we'll use their empty weights for a better comparison. Bell's design would sit at 23,280 pounds, whereas the HE-177 sat at 37,038 pounds. And I feel like these two planes are a decent comparison, especially considering that the HE-177's main fuselage was pretty thin as well. But with this significant reduction in weight, Bell projected that the Model 67 would have a cruising altitude at or above 70,000 feet, a range of 3,300 miles, and powered by a pair of J57 turbojets, a top speed of 553 miles an hour. So at least in the specs that really mattered here, the altitude and range, the Bell design was the best of the competition, the belle of the ball, if you will. And because of that, of the three aircraft, both the Bell design and the Martin design would be accepted for further work, and the Fairchild project would be dropped. as the Martin design was a conversion of an already established design. Despite it not hitting the requested specs, it was still better than what America had at the moment, so it was to serve as a stopgap design until Bell's design could be produced and sent out for service. An order for 28 of the Bell design was placed, with the first model anticipated to be ready in 18 months, and with it being accepted for production, it was given the official designation of X-16. Now, the X-16 technically didn't deserve that name. The X-planes, many of which were actually made by Bell, coincidentally, were largely experimental aircraft that sought to test various methods of propulsion and different design features and whatnot. The X-planes were almost exclusively experimental and were not intended to go into full-scale production. But the X-16 was intended to go into production. So why did it receive that name? Well, it was to cover the true nature of the project. It was a spy plane, after all, and the whole point of it is that it would be flying over the Soviet Union undetected, gathering secret info on what they were doing. So if the Soviets knew about this plane's true purpose, they would be on the lookout for it, and its missions could be compromised. So they wanted to disguise its true purpose. And if the Soviets found out about it through their spy network, they would hopefully just think it was a purely experimental X-plane and nothing more. While this was a rather simple bit of subterfuge, it does show that the Air Force viewed the X-16 as a very important plane, and every measure had to be taken to keep the project's true purpose hidden. However, to spoil the end here, this bit of subterfuge that spoiled the good experimental name of the X-planes ended up being completely pointless, and it was because of the interference of the CIA. Even though they weren't part of the design, study, and competition, information about the Bald Eagle spy plane program made its way over to Lockheed, and seemingly not wanting to be left out, they would propose their own high-altitude recon plane in early 1954. They elected to go with a heavily modified version of their XF-104 Starfighter, which itself was relatively early in its development, with the official designation CL-282. Most notably, Lockheed proposed using a General Electric J-73 jet engine, rather than the J-57. And because of this, and the fact that Martin and Bell were already working on their designs, Lockheed's unsolicited proposal was rejected. Undeterred, Lockheed would present their design once again, but this time to the CIA, who had been wanting to have aircraft of their very own, as they relied directly on the military for CIA missions and aerial reconnaissance. And so to make things easier and to be their own independent entity, they wanted their own aircraft. So the CIA would help promote the CL-282 to a committee of scientists and military minds, who would then recommend the project over Martin's design due to its greater altitude potential, and over the X-16, likely due to Lockheed having the ability to produce their design faster, as it was promised that the first plane would be ready in just 8 months rather than 18 months. This recommendation would then be communicated to the Secretary of Defense and the Director of the CIA, who themselves communicated the recommendation to President Eisenhower, who then decided to authorize $35 million in funding for 20 total CL-282s. With the authorization of the CL-282, there was no real point in having both the Martin design and the X-16 in development alongside it, and as the Martin design was considered to be just a short-term stopgap, it would be continued, albeit in very small numbers. Meanwhile, the X-16, despite the first aircraft being about 80% complete, it would be cancelled in late 1955, never to be completed or take to the air for even a single prototype flight. Thus, the Bell X-16 faded away into nothing, sitting today as a rare, officially designated X-plane that technically wasn't even an X-plane that was never finished. As for the CIA's baby, the CL-282, it ended up receiving a new name further into its development, and that name was the U-2, basically the spy plane of the Cold War era. So while the X-16 did lose out to a legendary plane, it really only lost because the CIA wanted their own aircraft and put their thumb on the scale. I guess you could say in the U-2, the CIA found what they were looking for and left the X-16 where the streets have no name. You get it? Like, the U2 songs still haven't found what I'm looking for and where the streets have no name? Okay. Alright, and with that, we're gonna go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. So, the other day, I bought the Pimp My Ride game for the PlayStation 2, because I saw it, and how could I not buy it, really? And it's simultaneously really fun, and also terrible. Like, the gameplay isn't very good, and there really isn't much to the game as a whole, like it's very repetitive, but the modifications you can make to the cars go above and beyond the ridiculous things that they did in the show, which makes it really interesting at the same time. And also the voice acting in it is kinda bad and therefore hilarious, and they got Exhibit in it, I think. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.